is one of the largest man-made lakes in the world.
Upstream at the Glen Canyon Dam, key underwater tubes have been deemed unreliable.
In August 2025, a satellite captured Lake Powell from orbit, revealing a bathtub ring carved by retreating water.
That could pose a potential threat to delivery of water here in southern Nevada in the future, especially if water levels continue to decline.
Marinas sat stranded on dry land, while boat ramps stretched into open air. Just 64 feet separated the turbines from failure, and we are watching it unfold in time. And this story begins where engineered certainty meets a river gone missing. The illusion of stability. For decades, Lake Powell stood as a triumph of modern engineering, an immense reservoir stretching 186 miles upstream, held in place by the towering Glen Canyon Dam. At full capacity, it was a symbol of control, storing over 24 million acre-feet of water and delivering electricity to 7 states. Tourists flocked to its shores, houseboats dotted its surface, and the hum of turbines powered cities hundreds of miles away. It was a monument to our belief that nature could be regulated, rationed, and repurposed. But in August 2025, satellite images shattered that illusion. The waterline had dropped to 3,554 feet, just 64 feet above the point at which the dam's turbines would cease to function. The shimmering lake was now bordered by a stark white bathtub ring, 162 feet of calcium-stained canyon wall, marking water that had vanished. Boat ramps ended in dust. Marinas sat stranded far from the shoreline. What looked like drought was something deeper, quieter, and far more permanent. This wasn't a dry spell. It was structural collapse, an unraveling of assumptions built into every pipe, canal, and power line downstream. The 64-foot buffer wasn't a margin of safety. It was a countdown, one that had already begun ticking before we noticed. A river built on false promises. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 was a masterpiece of optimism, an agreement that parceled out 16.5 million acre-feet of water annually among 7 United States states and Mexico. At the time, negotiators believed the river could reliably provide 16.4 million acre-feet each year. That assumption shaped everything: water rights, infrastructure investments, even the placement and size of dams like Glen Canyon. But the belief was built on a hydrological illusion. Scientists now know the early 20th century was one of the wettest periods in the last millennium. Tree ring studies conducted decades later revealed the long-term average flow of the Colorado River is just 13.5 million acre-feet. That means the system was overallocated by nearly 3 million acre-feet from the start. What looked like prudent planning was, in fact, an institutional gamble masked as certainty. For a while, it seemed to work. From the 1980s through the late 1990s, Lake Powell remained nearly full. The reservoir acted like a buffer, its high water levels concealing the river's actual limits. But beginning in 2000, flows began to fall. Between 2000 and 2025, the average annual runoff dropped to 12.5 million acre-feet. And in the worst years, it fell below 3.5 million. The illusion cracked, and then it failed. This overpromise, an entire legal and hydraulic framework based on misread data, set the stage for what followed. Allocation agreements written in ink couldn't adapt to a climate written in water. Contracts assumed abundance. Nature delivered less. And now, the gap between what we expect and what the river provides is no longer theoretical. It is etched into the walls of Glen Canyon and measured in feet of vanishing water. The problem wasn't just the drought. It was the belief that the river was ever big enough to begin with. The numbers that lied. In a system engineered to precision, it was the numbers themselves that began to falter. For over a decade, the Bureau of Reclamation issued forecasts projecting Lake Powell's stability, relying on models that assumed the past was still prologue. But reality drifted further from expectation with each passing year. Between 2009 and 2023, 11 out of 14 forecasts overestimated inflows, collectively predicting 2.8 million acre-feet more than what actually arrived. Year after year, the river underperformed, but the models refused to adjust. Eric Kuhn, former manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District, tracked this chronic optimism. His analysis revealed a pattern not of error, but of denial, a refusal to update expectations in the face of mounting evidence. Forecasting tools, once trusted, now became instruments of false reassurance. Meanwhile, the physical reservoir betrayed its own secrets. Glen Canyon is shaped like a martini glass, wide at the top, narrow at the base. When the lake is full, each vertical foot holds vast volumes of water, but as levels fall, each foot contains less. The top 50 feet store 4 million acre-feet. The bottom 50, just 1.2 million. The closer the lake gets to its base, the faster it drains. In 2023, record snowpack brought temporary relief. Headlines declared recovery, yet Lake Powell rose only from 25% to 35% of capacity. It was the illusion of rebound without actual resilience. Scientists like Brad Udall from Colorado State University called out the contradiction. The Colorado River we designed infrastructure for does not exist anymore. We are managing a smaller river with the same demands. And the demands haven't changed. Despite decades of warning signs, the legal framework still treats 16.5 million acre-feet as real. But the numbers say otherwise. And they're not lying. We just refuse to listen. The scientific warning nobody listened to. In 2021, the United States Geological Survey published a finding that should have triggered alarm far beyond the Colorado River Basin. According to their research, climate change alone, without any increase in water demand, could reduce Colorado River flows by up to 31% by 2050 compared to 20th century averages. This wasn't a projection based on usage or management failures. It was physics. Warming accelerates evaporation. For every degree Fahrenheit increase, evaporation rises by roughly 2%. Since 1980, the basin has already warmed 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, with models projecting another 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. Snowpack declines and melts earlier, soil moisture diminishes, and runoff shrinks. The result is a river system vanishing from the inside out, no matter how carefully it's managed. This finding reframed the crisis. The threat was no longer just misallocation or overuse. It was the fundamental disappearance of supply. Even the most heroic conservation efforts couldn't offset the losses baked into the climate system. The river, in its current form, was destined to shrink. Yet these projections barely registered in mainstream policy debates. While emergency measures focused on buying time, few acknowledged that time itself was becoming irrelevant. The 31% decline wasn't a possibility. It was a trajectory. The question was no longer whether cities and farms could cut back. It was whether the system they were fighting to preserve had already slipped past the point of sustainability. Because if the river keeps shrinking, then every agreement, tunnel, and turbine built upon it becomes an artifact, not of adaptation, but of denial. Band-aids on a hemorrhage. Faced with a shrinking river and collapsing storage, policymakers turned to stopgap measures, none of which addressed the core instability. The first tool was conservation. In 2023, the Biden administration announced a $13 billion plan to incentivize reduced water use, aiming to conserve 3 million acre-feet by 2026. By 2024, half that goal had been reached. On paper, it looked promising. In reality, the math didn't close. The system's structural deficit was 5.4 million acre-feet per year. Saving 1.5 million was like patching a hull breach with tape. Residential savings across the basin amounted to just 300,000 acre-feet annually. Las Vegas cut per capita use from 118 to 108 gallons, a meaningful gesture, but its famous fountains still sprayed skyward and golf courses remained emerald green. Agriculture, the elephant in the canal, used 80% of Colorado River water. California's Imperial Irrigation District alone claimed 3.1 million acre-feet annually. It reduced use by 8%, while continuing to export water-intensive crops like alfalfa to Saudi Arabia. The optics of sacrifice masked the reality of inertia. The second tool was upstream reservoir releases. In 2021, emergency orders sent 1 million acre-feet from Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs to prop up Lake Powell. But those reservoirs served their own ecosystems, economies, and states. Each release was a quiet act of cannibalization, borrowing from tomorrow to survive today. The third tool, infrastructure modification, was a race against time, but planning bypass tunnels or lowering intake structures takes years, and Powell, already dropping, wasn't waiting. The legal and political deadlock. By the summer of 2025, the emergency actions delaying Lake Powell's collapse were colliding with a political wall. The current operating agreements, rules determining how much water each state receives, were set to expire on December 31st, 2026. After that, there would be no binding mechanism to enforce cuts or cooperation. The clock wasn't just ticking on the reservoir, it was ticking on governance itself. Negotiations among the 7 United States basin states, plus Mexico, had stalled. The upper basin states proposed the lower basin cut 2 million acre-feet annually. The lower basin countered that the upper basin should absorb the same reduction. But even if both concessions were made, a 1.4 million acre-foot gap would remain. The math refused to compromise. Legal experts warned that, without consensus, the federal government might be forced to intervene, a step without precedent in the Colorado River's history. Lawsuits would follow. Years of litigation could paralyze meaningful action while the water kept disappearing. The most radical engineering proposals, like drilling bypass tunnels through Glen Canyon Dam, faced their own gridlock. For the upper basin, draining Powell meant surrendering legal leverage. For the lower basin, it meant losing storage security. Politics turned problem-solving into brinksmanship, and all the while, the river kept shrinking. They built a dam to hold back a river, and a future they didn't want to face. But water remembers its path. And now, it's carving truth into stone. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe and tell us, what would you do with the last 64 feet?